Hello, Professor and classmates. My name is Phoebe, and I'll be presenting on the assigned reading for this week, Avatar and Colonialism by Nathan Eckstrand, and Return of the Natives by Slavoj Zizek. Eckstrand, after going briefly through the plot of Avatar and how our protagonist, Jake Sully, saw the harm and destruction humans have brought upon the Na'vi people, and developed a moral compass with the help of the Na'vi princess Neytiri. Eckstrand brought up the question of, is Avatar opposed to colonialism in all its forms, or does colonialism still creep back in after their success in fending off the colonizers? He proceeded to answer those questions by examining how colonialism functions and what it means when philosophers argue that a form of colonialism persists to this day, even after most colonized countries have officially regained their national sovereignty. He referred to Frantz Fanon's writing for the first part of this paper. Fanon was a French West Indian psychiatrist and political philosopher who had lived in Martinique, Algeria, and Tunisia, which are all colonized by French. His works have become influential in the field of post-colonial studies, critical theory, and Marxism. Eckstrand described Fanon, like Jack, was able to straddle the divide between the colonizers and the colonized, seeing the conflict from both sides, just as Jake's acceptance by both Quaritch and the Na'vi allowed him to reveal Quaritch's fighting method to the Na'vi so they can plan their counterattack. Fanon's experience as he grew up in a French colony and his subsequent revolutionary activities provided him with enough perspective to develop a handbook of the effect of the colonialism. In the rest of the earth, the most familiar and visible element of colonialism is direct military control of land, resources, and people. Policemen and the soldier, who are the official, institute the go-between, the spokesperson of the settler, and his rule of oppression. It is obvious here that the agents of government speak the language of pure force. The colonized are kept in place and prevented from reaching the colonizer, and the colonizer never having direct contact with the colonized. Preferring to send policemen and soldiers instead, like Slavoj sending Quaritch and his sect or forces over, then later Jake and the scientists. Hell's Gate, humans' facility for all human colonial activities on Pandora, are made to completely segregate with the Navi's world. Since diplomacy seems doomed to failure, Fanon argued for the importance of communal struggles for liberation, struggles that will most likely involve violence, and that he felt were valuable for helping the colonized to reject colonial values and to develop a shared history. Jake, Neytiri, and the other Na'vi recognized the negotiation with the human are not an option, so they came together to oppose the invader violently and develop a sense of solidarity while doing so. Though we also have to know that the Na'vi are in a slightly different situation since they were never fully colonized like those in the French colonies. Fanon believed the natives were within their rights to respond with their own form of positive, constructive violence. That is, violence that builds a community instead of tearing it apart. The practice of violence binds them together as a whole, since each individual forms a violent link in the great chain. A part of the great organism of violence which has surged upward in reaction to the settlers' violence in the beginning. The Na'vi already have a well-developed sense of community at the beginning of the movie, and became even so when they raised war against humans, bring together different clans and resolving the possible tribal animosities. While violence is not always the optimal tactic, but both Fanon and Na'vi recognize its potential cleansing power and its ability to organically generate a new and more uniform world. Aside from the military control, Fanon pointed out in his other book, Black Skin, White Masks, reveal how colonizers are able to affect the shared identity of the colonized people through something as simple as linguistic practices. Because of how language are used every day, in multiple contexts and situations, it became an excellent way to reassert control by instilling in it a sense of inferiority or enslavement. Racial slur, i.g., in this situation, blue monkeys and fly-biting savages that live in tree, the barrier separating people like Selfridge from the Navi keeps the latter from having to endure the verbal sling and arrow. And aside from military control, there is this element of colonialism that is often constructed as the justification of what the colonizer will be doing next. These colonizers would provide goods and build structures that they think would be beneficial to the colonized, like roads, schools, and hospitals, without even knowing if the colonized needed them, and if assumed that the colonized wants them. Fanon pointed out the negative dependency and inferiority complex that it would create. Colonization erases the old society, replacing it with a new one that makes the native depend on the settlers for these new goods and services to which they have become accustomed. The colonized may even become dependent upon the colonizer for their sense of self. The colonizer claims superiority while forcing the colonized into continued subjugation. I start suffering from not being a white man insofar as the white man discriminates against me, turns me into a colonized subject, rob me of any value of originality. As we have seen, the white man is governed by a complex of authority, a complex of leadership, whereas the colonized is governed by a complex of dependency. Fortunately for the Navi, had allowed the human to provide at least one service for them in the past, namely Grace's school, where some of them have learned English. Fortunately, they have never fallen for the dependency trap that Fanon warned against, and that would have been a very different movie. They rejected the crash consumerism and exploitation of nature embodied by the human lust, and instead reaffirming their respect for Awa and for the interconnection of all its life. Fanon's analysis influenced many thinkers, who had expanded his critique to investigate other ways in which colonialism can manifest itself, not having direct or military control. These ways that may involve economic, social, or other forms of domination are termed neocolonialism. The most important thinker of neocolonialism is Edward Said. His major work, Orientalism, cataloged how Western knowledge about the history and culture of the East has allowed and continued to allow colonialism to occur. He analyzed the writing of a number of different authors in a given historical period to show how the knowledge they collectively produce contains certain biases, which in turn create and sustain prejudice within their society. Said explained these so-called facts and concepts can play a political role, even if the one that have spoken those words doesn't realize that. And he's interested in how their various statements about the East have helped to enable colonial practices. Eckstrand brings us back to Avatar for us to further understand this. Quaritch and Slavoj worldview is necessitated by their role within a capitalist enterprise, and they viewed the mineral primarily as a commodity and anything standing in their way as an obstacle. Already having a not so good view on the Navi, When they heard in Jake's video log that the Na'vi will never leave their home tree, they concluded that no diplomatic solution is possible and that military action is necessary. Then there's Grace, the scientist developing and testing knowledge about Na'vi and Pandora's wildlife. She's closely welded to scientific worldview, and it reflects on the scientific language she uses to describe Pandora. Though they may be both accurate, but the difference in vocabulary and metaphor reflects the different purposes they serve. One way of speaking allows the Na'vi to see themselves as a part of a larger entity that includes all life on Pandora, while the other suggests a more impersonal understanding, which sees the planet more like a computer. In the first arc of the story, Grace, because of her role as an exobiologist, is not required to consider how the human occupation of Pandora might affect the well-being of Na'vi. Her task is simply to observe, quantify, and analyze data about the flora and fauna of Pandora. As a result, some of her interaction with the Na'vi suggests that she sees them as a mere object of study and not subject with unique capability, desires, and interests. And now we know how one job, environment, and socioeconomic background could shape their outlook. This can help us to understand this in neocolonialism. Why it is possible for a biased knowledge to perpetuate a colonial situation long after colonizing force have left. According to Said, one of the myths that people thought it as knowledge is that people from the East area are ignorant, violent, and impotent. This was used by the British and French in the 1800s to justify their occupation of much of the East for their resources, raised them as Christians, and had them practice Western laws. Another case where Islam are convinced to be a violent religion whose influence in the Middle East must be destroyed. Thoroughly biased knowledge about the East is used to justify discriminatory economic system, social structures, and individual perceptions. The same with what would have happened if the humans were not forced off Pandora at the end of the movie, but allowed to stay instead. Their capitalist and scientific worldview might have determined their relationship with the Na'vi. Economic, social, and political structure could have easily developed that treated the Na'vi and their world as commodities or as objects for scientific research. Neocolonialism structures can be established without any of the gunfire that normally accompany colonialization, but they could be just as effective in ensuring the continued domination of the Na'vi by the humans. Finally, Eckstrand began examining on the part of the common trope of the white man saving the natives. Despite the nobleness and gracefulness of the Na'vi, they still portray old stereotypes of the native people. They live a primitive lifestyle in harmony with nature. They sport outlandish jewelry and hairstyle. They're uninterested in learning about others or venturing beyond their own boundaries, and they worship the spirits of plants and animals. The difference is that the movie idolized them as sign of wisdom and goodness. However, as they are admired for these traits, they are not depicted as capable of fully understanding or interpreting them by themselves. Avatar's narrative shows the Na'vi as incapable of saving themselves. It takes Jake's knowledge and bravery to convince them to form an effective plan of attack against the colonizing force on Pandora. There are 3 instances that's provided in the paper. The first is there was no attempt of unifying clan by writing the Turuk, which Jake have done in an instance. And second, no one were able to move Awa to help in defending Pandora with their prayer. And 3, other experienced Na'vi are found not worthy of leading. The second half of Avatar is fueled by the idea that the white man, Jake, is the one most capable of saving the natives. The Na'vi, while capable of mounting some defense on their own, become effective only when Jake takes the reign of power. This is the narrative of the white savior, which both Fanon and Saeed believe lurks at the heart of colonialism and makes the natives appear impotent. By the end of the movie, the specter of the colonialism unfortunately still remains. Moving on to Zizek's Return of the Natives. He pointed out that although Avatar's narrative is supposed to take place in one and the same real reality, we are dealing at the level of the underlying symbolic economy with two realities: the ordinary world of imperialist colonialism on the one hand, and the fantasy world populated by the Aborigines who live in an incestuous link with nature. And the ending of the movie should be read as the hero fully migrating from reality into the fantasy world. Choosing between either accepting reality or choosing fantasy was wrong if we really want to change or escape our social reality. The first thing to do is change our fantasies that make us fit this reality. And because Jake doesn't do that, in Zizek's opinion, he will very soon start to feel discontent and disappointed. Pandora is perfect, and precisely was that reason of perfection, we as the subject of imagination loses its sense of belonging. Zizek brought up the Hollywood formula for producing a couple: the white hero who has to go among the savages to find a proper sexual partner, and used Reds by Warren Beatty as an example. Later brought up Titanic by James Cameron to give us focus on another fantasy and reality problem. Was Titanic really about the catastrophe of the ship hitting the iceberg? And by asking this, of course, no would be the answer. The real catastrophe is the life Jack and Rose are going to live after they run away together like they promised. Rose was a spoiled high society girl with an identity crisis. Because her life was too perfect, her path, her life are all designed and laid out to her, and she meet this potential love partner that could save her from this. It is not uncommon for the higher classes to seek the liveliness in the lower class whenever they have their own identity crisis. And by doing so, it also consolidates the higher class they're in, because they see how well their lives are comparing to the lower class. As Jake is slowly sinking into the water, though crying she'll never let him go, she pushed him away with her hands, because he had served this purpose of restoring Rose's sense of identity and purpose of life, and the sinking of the ship have sustained the illusion of their happiness. Though many modern movies have changed their ways of creating couples, Avatar kept the formula. Its full trust in fantasy and its story of a white man marrying the Aboriginal princess and becoming king make it ideologically a rather conservative old-fashioned film. Under the political correct theme is a brutal racial motive. The only choice the Aborigines have is to be saved by the human beings or to be destroyed by them. They can choose either to be the victim of imperialist reality or to play their allotted role in the white man's fantasy. As Avatar is making money all around the world, something that strangely resembles its plot is taking place in the world. At the southern hill of the Indian state of Orissa, inhabited by the Dondrian Kong people, being sold there to mine. Even after 60 years of India's so-called independence, they had not have access to education, healthcare, or legal redress. They are mercilessly exploited for decades, consistently cheated by small businessmen and moneylenders. In response to this, a Maoist armed rebellion exploded. The real things that are happening in society are ignored. White men are allowed to start war in order to defend the minorities, but when the subject is not white, they became terrorists and a threat to the country. Zizek concluded that the film enabled us to practice a typical ideological division, sympathizing with the idealized Aborigines while rejecting their actual struggle. The true avatar is thus Avatar itself, the film substituting for reality. That's the end of my presentation. Thank you.